Welcome to this month's episodes of The Governance Voice, the podcast for Governance Professionals of Canada, or GPC. I'm your host, Letricia Fullerton. Here at GPC, I'm the Manager of Administration, Education, and Special Projects, and I'm also one of your podcast hosts. As you know, we're always looking for trending and pressing governance topics to discuss. We hope that our podcast helps all governance professionals of Canada to better support, guide, and influence their boards and organizations. Today, we're going to be sitting down with John Dinner, the president of John T. Dinner Board Governance Services. His Canadian consulting firm is a leader in corporate governance and board effectiveness. For more than 25 years, John has been helping Canadian board in all sectors to improve their performance and their organization successes. His area of expertise covers leading edge governance practices, including board committee and director effectiveness evaluations, board education, meeting and decision-making effectiveness, information management, and related services. John has been a huge part of GPC's professional development courses. He's been a consistent speaker in our flagship Meetings, Minutes, and Running Effective Board Meetings event. He's also working with us on several sessions, such as setting up the stage for boardroom success, board and committee director assessments, as well as non-for-profit governance. John has been a huge part of GPC's professional development courses. He's been a consistent speaker at our flagship Meetings, Minutes, and Running Effective Board Meetings event. He's also been working with us on several sessions, such as setting the stage for boardroom success, board and committee director assessments, as well as non-for-profit governance. He's also one of the faculty in our GPC designation program. On April 7th, we have another session with John, Board Culture, an Essential Requirement of Governing Well. It was such a refreshing new topic that we wanted to discuss it as a podcast as well. We always love to chat with John on his passion of governing change and practical tools and ways that we can make a difference. So let's get right into it, John. How are you today?
I'm doing really well, Letricia, as you know, and our listeners may not. We've had a snowstorm, and normally it's quite possible I would have been trying to get to the airport today and hopping a flight, but given the pandemic,
yeah, we're stuck.
I'm in my home office, and I didn't have to worry about that today, right? So
Likewise.
Actually, there's some upside to all of this craziness.
Definitely, it makes traveling a lot easier.
For sure. Yes. From upstairs to downstairs.
Definitely. Okay. So let's start off with something simple, John. We're hearing a lot about board culture, but it still seems elusive. What are we talking about when we talk about board culture?
Yeah, I think there is more attention for sure being placed on board culture. The language is sort of part of, I think, the narrative when we talk about boardroom effectiveness and governing well. I'm not sure if it's got that far past that. Mm-hmm. It may be just mere talk. But when I think about what boardroom culture is, first of all, I would say every boardroom has its own unique culture. And often I think boards haven't actually identified it or described it or come to terms with it. But I really sort of think of it in terms of what's the tenor and tone of the board team in terms of working together as a collective in the decision-making process. So what does that look like? What does it feel like? How does it play out? Mm-hmm. From a relational perspective and a group contributing together. Right. And then the relationship between board and management, and what does that look like? Sort of sharing power and control, and how well or not does that happen? And I guess that would be a starting point for me describing or defining a board's own culture.
What board culture is, okay. So where have you seen boardroom culture show up in your work?
Well, I see it with every client, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe the more salient question is, where have I seen it where it's been perhaps really the ideal or really problematic? And I would say there's lots in between along that spectrum. They kind of reside somewhere. But one sort of situation that I recall, and I think it's perhaps more particularly relevant to representative boards where you have different stakeholders around the table,
Okay.
And so there's sometimes a competitiveness, right? They're there because the members have skin in the game, as I call it, outside of their role as directors. And so they bring to the table already a sense that, well, I have to gain something or achieve something for those that I represent. And that can be problematic, even though you're supposed to be there to act in the best interest of the corporation. I think in theory that's easy, but they know after a meeting there's going to be people who are going to be kind of interested. So did we win or did we lose? And I've seen that where it becomes very adversarial and in the extreme very dysfunctional. And it's a matter of how do you get a group with kind of maybe disparate or conflicting interests to work together as a collective group, a decision-making body. And in that particular case, because it was early days in my consulting work. And I came up with the idea of them actually sort of coming up with a board or a governance vision. What did they want to say was true about the board, say 2 to 3 years from now, that wasn't true today, and what work had to be done to get them there? And that really helped them sort of coalesce around a common purpose or mission or goal, which really helped to, soften those edges, where there were differences and where there were conflicts. So I would say it impacted everything the board did, and usually in negative fashion, because it really was dysfunctional. And when people spoke, the lens people used to listen or view the other director was, oh, you're part of that group, or I know what you're going to say, I know what your motivation is, right? And that
instead of being self-serving, I guess, right? Because where I guess it could, where that can be somewhat toxic, which you'll probably answer in some of our upcoming questions, was when instead of being self-serving, you're more being inclusive of their board, right?
For sure. And being part of sort of a team, right? That's why we have boards, is because some critical organizational decisions are being made. And it's a group decision to which ideally everyone is going to commit to and kind of have co-ownership of. And that can be challenging if everyone's kind of not on the same page, working together, and putting some of those differences to the side for the benefit of the organization. So I mentioned representative boards as being, perhaps more at risk than some others, but certainly I think it happens to varying degrees in every boardroom. And it's a topic that I think boards really need to look at a lot more closely and begin addressing more explicitly.
So why do you think it's important? Why do you think boardroom culture is important? Why do you think boards should be talking about this?
Yeah. So if we go back, let's say, this whole focus on corporate governance is, give or take, about 30 years old. Early 90s in Canada anyways, that's when we really started focusing on.
Way older than I am.
Yes, that's right, for sure. So that's why I felt compelled to remind you or make you aware of it. Give you a little history lesson from the dark ages. But back then, I think governance has evolved, focusing on, first of all, on structure. So how many board members, what kind of committees, how often do you meet, that sort of stuff, which was great. And then they started focusing more on process, like how boards actually do their work. And that was good progression. And you can codify those, there's these best practices or guidelines or whatever. So you can put those in documents and you can agree on those. Boardroom culture is something entirely different, right? But you think if you don't have a group of directors who sort of have trust and confidence in each other, structure or process isn't going to get you very far. Right. Because I would say boardroom culture is almost foundational so that, structure and process can really live up to their potential. But it gets so easily undermined if you've got conflicting views or lack of respect or competitiveness or whatever it is between board members. Part of it is just sort of recognizing what's going on in the room at any given time. I think even on the best boards, to varying degrees, there's biases around the table, and who's the one, or how are those biases going to get surfaced and addressed? Right. And until they do, I would say a board's operating suboptimally. And so the structure or processes that you might be following aren't going to extricate you from that challenge.
All right, that makes sense. So how do people determine if their board dynamic is healthy or if it's toxic?
Yeah. Well, and I guess I don't even know if it has to be toxic per se, but that would be an extreme.
But there's some.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely. For sure. And I would say it's more
Rogers.
toxic to individual directors too, right? What they
Right.
experience depending on who they are and how they relate and how they are regarded by their board peers, right? So I would
Right.
say for sure, there would be individual director experiences, which would be more toxic than to others. So healthy, I don't think there is, you could come up with some general ideas as to what would, constitute a healthy boardroom culture. And I would say, respect for each other and openness, welcoming of new ideas and different perspectives, a board where directors really listen to each other and engage and explore, as opposed to maybe a board where, someone like John Dinner speaks up and I want it to be the final word, right? Like I impart my wisdom. And if Letricia across the table from me were to sort of say, oh, I want to add, or I want to challenge that, like I may not, take kindly to that.
Right.
As opposed to saying, wow, I really appreciate a different perspective or someone else's, experience or understanding.
Yeah.
And I would say in our culture, sort of writ large in, Western society, most of us are raised to be pretty independent, self-sufficient, and autonomous. And so we don't, I would say, engage in groups naturally or intuitively. I think it's something that we really have to learn because we're just not wired that way a lot. Now, it may come down to personality, like individual personality types, but I think, again, our culture doesn't really espouse that. We talk a lot about teams, but I wonder, I question how much we really embrace it to take the theory into practice and really, where you've got that interdependence of board members, right? Relying on each other.
Yeah.
As defined. But I would say that would be towards the healthy end of the spectrum. And then we sort of talked about already what an unhealthy board. I think part of the question is, I don't think boards really even inquire or probe about their boardroom culture.
No, I don't. I wouldn't see how that would be. Like, who really sits back and says, is my board healthy? Is this a healthy environment? I mean, maybe when they're self-reflecting and if there's an issue, they may, if there's a, probably a personal issue with someone or something that the board is doing, where they would actually take the time to reflect on that. But for the most cases, but who knows? I don't really see it.
And again, one director's experience could be far different than another's.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. Because it's really based on your own, what my view of a healthy dynamic may not necessarily be your view, correct? And in the same, I guess, goes with being in a toxic situation. You may think, I may take something and it's 100 for me, and where you're like telling the situation and it's like, what's the big deal, Letricia? Like, what? Relax. So
that's right. So. Yeah, as opposed to me saying, wow, something's wrong here, right? Like if this isn't working for Letricia, then I should be, stopping things and sort of let's explore that a bit further, as opposed to, well, it's fine with me, so it should be fine with you.
No, definitely, for sure.
Which I think happens probably a lot. And I just think there's a lack of awareness. And part of it is, I think a lot of boards are just rather passive. We do what we have to do as directors. But do we then sort of say, let's build on that, the basics and to something where the board is really sort of high functioning and recognizing that the dynamic in the boardroom, the culture, how we relate with each other, how we work, how we navigate conflict and difference of opinion.
Right.
How much better off would we be as a governing body than if we were just to kind of accept the status quo until such time as, things kind of explode or become untenable. And then you sort of say, oh boy, now we're trying to, dig ourselves out of the ditch, as opposed to saying, things seem to be functioning fairly well, but let's not take it for granted. Let's
Right.
really delve into it and find out from people like Letricia, like, what is your experience?
Right.
And is it different, or is it, better or worse, what have you?
And that also ties into and maybe this is a totally different podcast, but the whole board effectiveness portion of it as well. Because if board members are just there to do the status quo, then how effective are you really being?
For sure.
Then challenging and taking things kind of out of the box. So I don't know, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we sort of accommodate less than optimal board performance, because it's often, we recognize that the role of the board chair, for example, is to, draw out those directors who may not engage as much as they might. Well, I think what you're saying, you proverbially, is saying that, we accept the fact that there are going to be underperforming directors on our board.
Right.
That's kind of part of the board culture, right?
Right.
And we have to draw them out, as opposed to sort of setting expectations and the bar such that, all board members should be capable and feel the obligation to participate and contribute to the work of the board proactively.
Definitely.
As opposed to, giving them, leeway to be not as active as they might be. And we also let other board members at the other end to be, perhaps overbearing and participate more than they should.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like everyone's crossing their fingers, I think, and saying, I hope this ends soon, right? But it's kind of like everyone looks around and say, whose job is this to tell, this person that, okay, time out.
Right.
We've heard more than enough. Or the language you're using is offensive and unproductive.
Right.
Or what you're talking about has little to no relevance to the topic we're addressing on the agenda, right? And I would say, how much better to have a boardroom culture where, there's an expectation. If myself as a director, I'm not really contributing, that I sort of almost give permission to sort of say, hey, call me out, right? Like, I'm here to do a job. I'm not here to be, wear you down or you to tolerate me. So I think that speaks a lot to kind of what happens in the boardroom, instead of just the rolling of eyes and hoping against hope that, this will end soon and we can get on with things.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So John, we've been in this pandemic for, I don't even know, like, I think every day is like the same day for me right now, going into 3 years. Clearly, COVID, remote working, technology has made this situation more complicated, or maybe it's made it easier. How can board members and governance professionals get around these types of challenges?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we have to ask what the challenges are and be aware of them, because I think my sense is, and some of it's personal experience, some of it's observation, is that, I think board members think it's a major success if we can actually sign into the meeting. That's all we have, but it's a totally different environment. And what have boards done to say, how do we have to function differently? How does our way of relating to each other need to change to accommodate an online environment? And I'm not sure
because do you remember when when we used to do like teleconference meetings, or there would always be that person that would have static on the phone, or now it's like it's norm. It's okay. Like, let's move on. Right. It's all right. It happens.
Yeah. But part of the question is like, what have we lost by going online, and what have we gained? And how do we adjust to that, perhaps? And is it harder for people to engage? And if so, what do we do to try to make it easier for people to engage? There's pitfalls to everything, right? Being in person, there's pros and cons. Being online, pros and cons. It's identifying how do we mitigate the risk of being online during the pandemic, and how actually can we leverage whatever strengths or opportunities that it may present as well, right? So I don't think
Right.
it's all bad, but maybe we should have more shorter meetings, right? Like being online is tough.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I don't know how much real thinking has gone on. Perhaps part of it is we thought we'd be past this by now.
Right.
But I just wonder how much better decisions might be had we sort of invested the time up front to figure out how to actually participate as board members. Like every board member has to be distracted to varying degrees, more so online than they are in person, right?
Mhm.
It's just so easy to check out. It's almost impossible from time to time not to check out, right? So that has to have an impact. It's sort of like, oh man, where were we in that discussion? Or what did they just say? Or what agenda item are we on? Or, and I think, we've all figured out for the most part. So that might be a little extreme, some of those examples, but at the same time, it has created deficiencies which need to be acknowledged and steps taken to mitigate, I think. And I don't think, beyond providing some training, basic training on the technology, I don't know if boards have done a lot. And yet maybe this is a tool that we're going to be relying on, maybe not as much as we do today, but it's going to be, people are.
You think so? I think this might stick. I mean, I know a lot of people are still looking forward to being back in person, but I think now it's no longer going to be teleconferencing. It's going to be mainly Zoom. Like they're going to want to see you face to face.
For sure, absolutely. But I wonder what the impact of meeting in person is going to be, right? Like, are we gonna go back to that to varying degrees? Are we gonna supplement it with more online? Is it gonna be kind of that binary? It's either or. I don't think we've been able to figure that out. Yeah. Right. It's kind of like the workplace. Early on, I say we're never going back to the office ever again, and now, as you say, 2 years in, looking at year 3, people are saying, well, that was done before we knew anything, right? That's what we thought. And now we've got that experience. So what are we going to do? And I think the same applies to the boardroom.
Yeah, same. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So how should boards begin to tackle the topic of culture in their boardrooms?
Yeah. So I think
where would you begin?
Yeah. So I think one thing that I think directors and maybe management for that matter think constitutes kind of boardroom culture is a code of conduct, and it says, this is how we're going to behave, I guess. And I sort of think, what's in a code of conduct is really trying to mitigate against something that's either unethical, illegal, or inappropriate, as opposed to saying, what are we going to do from a behavioral perspective that's going to, just set this board up to perform at a much higher level than it would otherwise. And I think a first part is just sort of saying, let's actually describe what our boardroom culture is. Getting board member input, like how would you describe our boardroom culture? And consolidate that into a collective perspective and ask the question, so is this the boardroom culture we choose to have? Right, this is what it is. We've never actually, not that I think you should necessarily pass a resolution, henceforth, this is our boardroom culture, but it is a choice, I believe, and is the current ethos, tenor and tone of meetings, whatever, what we would choose. And if not.
And that's a question that's okay to ask. It's pretty much a question that's okay to ask. What is your boardroom culture to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And there may be conflicting views, right? Because presumably some people have given it more thought than others and have come up with different answers. So that's fine. But it's like getting to a process where you think, this is a pretty accurate reflection. I think I can go into most boardrooms, and after sitting there for a couple hours, I could probably, I'd be on the target. I may not get a bullseye with my assessment, but I'd be pretty close, right? It's pretty obvious.
And what do you do with that? What do you do with that? Does that help you to assess the board? Like, do you sit down and talk to them? Do you tell them?
Well, for sure. Yeah,
what you think
absolutely.
Their culture's like?
Part of it's the board evaluation process where that would come up, and I see how board members conduct themselves generally as a group or as some individuals, and how the board chair, how they lead and how people respond, how much they rely on how much deference there is to others. Those that, how many, directors are there really trying to steer or control the conversation or cut it short when a different, view is offered up that perhaps they don't agree with and they don't want to go down that path, right? I think there's all these kinds of examples that you might be able to look for. And you could, just ask, is this what we would choose to have? And if not, then what would the ideal be? And then you could actually, I believe you can define the kind of boardroom culture that you want. And you may not, again, define it once and for all the first time, but you'd sort of say, this is better than what we've got. And here's the gap. Let's work towards that. And over time, iteratively, you would change, right? And I think at the end of every meeting, perhaps you say, this is what we committed to as a board in terms of how we're going to function, how we're going to relate together, how we're going to work with management. Did we live up to that commitment? Did we fall short? If so, where? I think that's just a really productive exercise. So I kind of like the idea of, it's more of a commitment statement or a covenant. It's a promise to each other. This is as a board, this is what we commit to in terms of how we're going to function, in terms of boardroom culture, the relational piece. And I think that's a really good starting point. And then continually sort of asking the question, are we actually living up to it or not? Part of it is, I think, the kind of people that, boards recruit. We're so focused on skills, knowledge, and experience. You sort of say, but the personality that director brings into the boardroom is either going to help it or it's going to take away from our ability to function well in a collective decision-making forum. And how do we know? And how do we hold people accountable to behave in a certain way? I've often heard, and I think this might be part of it, when I do individual director assessments, there's a behavioral component that I put on there. And if they aren't explicitly identified, which often they're not, I'll sort of say, well, let's just use your core values as those. And often what I'd hear is, well, those apply to staff management. They don't apply to board members. And I'm thinking, really? Like, why wouldn't they apply to board members? So there is, I think, probably in a lot of organizations, there's behavioral expectations at a corporate level that can be extended to board members, and board members could be, held accountable for them, which would presumably positively impact the boardroom culture.
What are the next steps that you would take to improve boardroom culture? So I guess you pretty much said at the end of each meeting, recapping, I guess, what did we meet our expectations, or did we set out what we wanted to do for this board meeting? So while we're talking about tough times in the boardrooms, and how can governance professionals support healthy boardroom dynamics?
I think from a governance professional's perspective, it's perhaps feeding articles to directors on the topic and just increasing awareness that this is a topic that board members should be cognizant of and begin to address and give priority to. It may be, in working with the board chair, is to sort of identify instances during board meetings where, you think, how board members interacted with each other was sort of less than optimal. And is there something that could be done? So trying to, I think with the board evaluations, that process, injecting questions that are culturally related. So teasing out from that. And so I think it's maybe an iterative process. I think as governance professionals, we own so little, have a lot of accountability, but you sort of say, is that really within our job description? You sort of say, well, no, we aren't ultimately responsible, but we see things going on. And if it's not ideal or problematic, if it was any other topic, we would bring it, to the awareness of the board chair, committee chair, whoever. And I think that same approach is entirely appropriate. I don't think, a really competent board chair or whoever you're dealing with, it's not going to surprise them. It may be more that, they're just kind of used to it, or not sure if you can do anything about it. But I do think, I think there are, as I've already sort of described, I think there are opportunities to positively impact boardroom culture. I also think, from a management perspective, like they're the ones who see the board in operation.
Mhm.
And, if board members aren't living up to a certain ethos, like the values that the corporation espouses, or, how board members interact with each other in terms of respect and what have you, I think that can be, very demoralizing. And there's this kind of double standard that I talk about in boardrooms, where I think boards hold management to a much higher standard on a number of levels than they do
Right.
themselves. And we overlook or allow or just ignore things that we would never allow management to get away with, right?
Okay.
And I think that's part of it too. And I think if management is watching this play out, even if it's not that egregious, right?
Mhm.
But it's just the confidence and trust that management has in the board, I think, suffers if the board isn't holding themselves up to the highest standard in terms of, human relations and what have you.
Right. So what happens then when you're dealing with board directors that are not so eager to make a change?
Right. Well, I think part of it is what's, you might say, the value proposition of focusing and investing in that area. Like, what's the upside?
Mhm.
And if it's not that bad, what's the big deal? Like, I'm not bothered. So, but I do think, part of it is making each other aware of the impact that it does have. So I talked just briefly, or made suggestion around the biases that are common in the boardroom. I think there's several.
Right.
So boardrooms rely on experts, and we recruit for experts. But it then creates sort of a power structure. And so there's those who would sort of say, well, we have to listen to those who are an authority on a particular topic. And I'm not, if I'm not a financial person, then I should step back. We're going to rely on those who are, formally financially literate, whatever. So there's that kind of bias. There's groupthink, where we allow the majority to rule, even if, a minority of the board, has some concerns, the group, the majority sort of rules the day. And yet, the minority view may actually be really relevant. Sometimes I would say the status quo, it's a lot of work to, upset things, and not everyone is signing up for change. A lot of people resist it. And so there's this bias towards, let's just kind of maintain things the way they are. On my watch, I don't want to be the one criticized for a misstep or problem. So let's, leave things as they are. And I think another area of bias is just the tendency to confirm.
Right.
An argument is made in favor of doing something, and John Dinner, for example, is listening for things that confirm my own values, beliefs, and I may be more dismissive of those things that don't line up with what I typically believe to be true or factual
Right.
or relevant. So that none of those are terribly egregious. No one's being offended by those. But as a board member, like, if I allow those, if I don't sort of acknowledge, I do have biases, and here's what I have to do to balance those so they don't overtake. I'm really relying on my board colleagues to override my views.
Right.
So I think that's problematic. It could be as subtle and nuanced as that, and be problematic, right? So
as a governance professional, can you act as an agent of change within the boardroom? Like, it's okay for you to voice that, I guess is what I'm asking.
For sure. Yeah, I know. And I guess what do we mean by voicing these? It's sort of like, if you have a really great relationship with the board chair or the governance committee chair or whatever, like, they're the ones who are going to have to get it on the agenda and give it priority, give it life, give it legs, whatever. But I guess I always felt when I was an active corporate secretary that I had an obligation to, share my perspectives in a constructive way that I thought, the board would, benefit from it would be, would serve to enhance the board's performance. So I think with that posture, I think a lot of boards are really, receptive to doing things, perhaps differently than they have. And
Right.
I guess I view these things, from a risk perspective. And I guess when we think of, commonly held risks, the pandemic being, I guess, one of them for sure, like these risks don't look like other risks. And I don't think they normally get identified through a normal risk process, right? But if there are those biases, for example, then, can we support the status quo of those biases, or does something need to change? And if there's real dysfunction, like and toxicity in the boardroom, what risk does that pose to the decision-making process and the board actually being able to fulfill its obligations, and for, retaining, directors who may be of the mind that, hey, like this is not the kind of boardroom experience that I'm willing to, accommodate.
Right.
I'm going to go somewhere else where, not where I get my way, though I'm sure there's some board members who are like that, but it's more like, I'm heard, I'm invited, I'm respected, I bring value, and that's acknowledged by my board peers. And there really is a sense of, team, and maybe even defining, what does that mean?
Right.
Being part of a boardroom team in that governance context is different than maybe what we would typically define team as being. But I just think that sort of, collaborative approach is not something that gets a lot of time or attention. I think it's just assumed. And then if you really step back and ask how well it's functioning, I think people would, typically say, yeah, it's kind of wanting, right?
Yeah. It's like you said earlier, like when boards are looking for recruiting directors, they're always looking at the certain skills, whether they have finance, they have marketing, they have, advocacy and all those things. But it's also, we do tend to sometimes, or boards tend to sometimes overlook those soft skills. That are also really needed, and we discuss it in the soft skills session of the education program.
Absolutely.
With you, John. Those soft skills are definitely skills that are they're real attributes to a board, and they're needed in order to maintain that effectiveness that boards and that culture that boards are that they're looking for and longing to have, and what pretty much basically what we're talking about. So when we say that, what are the best ways to monitor and maintain the improvements made in boardroom culture? Like, what's your suggestion of ways to maintain improvements within boardroom culture?
Yeah, so I've already referred to kind of that board evaluation process. I think a lot of directors don't have a big appetite for having their own individual performance assessed. But I think, again, that's where it starts, right? With how myself as a board member shows up and engages with others, either constructively or not, or optimally or not. And I think those are areas that are really going to hopefully draw out, and there has to be a receptivity. John Dinner needs to be, when my performance is assessed, I need to have an openness, an invitation to feedback, and then a willingness to adapt and change. So there's that kind of that group assessments, just informal at the end of the meeting. Are we living up to this kind of group covenant or promise that we made to each other? And if not, where? I think part of the other thing, and I've mentioned this in other sessions around the role of board chair. I think sometimes board chairs, they see something going on in the boardroom, and they're juggling a whole bunch of different things, right? But there's a dynamic, and I think sometimes, boy, I just hope this will kind of end quickly, because I just don't want to disrupt things. But at the same time, I wonder if board chairs really feel like they have sort of explicit permission board members to kind of call a timeout and say, that this is not going particularly well right now. So let's just catch our breath and do a restart and carry on.
Don't they have that? They don't have that. No.
I don't know if they do. Like there'd be
No?
some who would have, maybe the self-confidence.
Right.
But others, I think at the end of the meeting, they look back and they may say, wow, like, I wish I had done something a bit differently. But I think part of that is symptomatic of the fact that, their board colleagues haven't said, like if I speak out of turn, if I drone on, if I do that, you have permission to call me out,
Right.
call timeout. I think it would make the board chair's job so much easier if they knew they could intervene and say, hey, like I think we need to, change tack here, move on, use more respectful language, not to be dismissive, the body language even, it gets to be that sometimes. I think we can all, in a group setting again, we can all to varying degrees be, held to account for our conduct. I'm just thinking of a situation. So I was with a large financial institution. It was going through a whole ownership structure change. It was about a 6-year process altogether. And years after, that was all done and I was out on my own, I was out doing work in another city in another province. And so I was trying to keep in touch with some of the directors. So I said, I'm in town. So he invited me to his office and we were just sort of chatting. And he made a statement that just kind of shocked me. He said, well, at some point, the whole thing was a fait accompli before a decision was even made, right? Like the whole thing had so much momentum. Management knew that they were going to be, enriched by us, crossing the finish line, that we'd gone beyond the point of no return. So it didn't really matter. And I sort of thought, like, are you serious? Are you serious? As a board member, you felt
this is how they felt.
A point in time that you were basically, powerless.
Yeah.
To intervene and say, this is not going the way we anticipated, or we need to adjust.
You were consulting this group? You were consulting?
No, I was just reconnecting with a person who I knew from the board.
Okay.
And so he was kind of filling me in as to what he was thinking in the boardroom while this was unfolding. And I just thought, boy, really, you didn't admit to that, right? And I wonder, did your board colleagues all think that or whatever?
Right. Yeah.
But it was like to think that a board member, if he said, you know what, this is what I think we're beyond the point of no return and this is what's going to happen, and the momentum is such that the board really doesn't have any authority to stop or change things. And if all the board members nodded and said, yep, you're absolutely right, that's the way we are, and that's, we all kind of agree, that's fine, then I say that's okay, right? To explicitly adopt a posture. But the fact that someone was just kind of thinking it and never expressed it,
right,
as maybe
and then they say too that if one's thinking that way, then I'm sure for sure there were others, but they just never said anything, right?
Yeah, which just goes to general group dynamics,
right?
And how they play out. And do we not, as board members, have a responsibility to fess up when we say, I think our authority has been minimize, compromise, I don't know, whatever it is, just because, we've got this, it's like a train going down the track and it's just gaining momentum and you're going downhill and there's no way you can stop it. But at least to acknowledge the fact that, we still need to, there's still risk in all of this. And what do we still have available to us as overseers, right? Otherwise, we might as well sort of pack up our bags and go home. Let's quit pretending that we're doing something meaningful in terms of our oversight when in your own mind you're thinking, the game is over, right? Like I could see how the cards are going to be played and they're, the last hand is obvious, right? Like the chess game, I know how, there may be moves on the board, but they're meaningless. And I would just sort of say, so that's just an example, a real life example. And no one knew about it, presumably. But that's what was going on in the minds of board members. And I think that I'd say, as you know, in terms of boardroom culture, there should be an obligation that if there's red flags, if there's concerns, if there's anything like that, then there's kind of, I would say, a moral obligation to kind of put that out on the table.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So to bring us to another real life example, was the whole Rogers fiasco, the whole Rogers boardroom drama.
Yeah.
I definitely see that that whole issue being a case study that will be used for many, many years to come.
For sure.
How that all played out. But how can, we talk a lot about CEOs versus chairs and how they fight for control and how that can really hurt that really hurts the board dynamics and the board culture and the whole decision-making processes. What tips do you have for the governance professionals who are stuck in situations like this?
Yeah. So I would say what we do typically is we define roles and responsibilities. This is what you're accountable for. This is what I'm accountable for. CEO, board, director, whatever, right? But we never ask the question, how are we going to work together? There's a lot of power at play between those responsibilities.
For sure. Yeah, definitely.
And we view the world differently. So the fact that there's going to be conflict, you know, we shouldn't be surprised. So when we inevitably run into conflict, how are we going to navigate that? Let's talk about that now. Like, is there a bit of a process that we could put in place? Like a commitment again, like we expect integrity, we expect honesty. So don't, give, significant issues kind of short shrift or try to sell us, or don't try to, minimize, the significance of issues. Let's put them out there. And if you're candid with us, we'll be candid and fair with you. This kind of navigating around each other, if and when it happens, can be really problematic. So I think just this whole, how are we going to work together? When things are going really well, when things aren't, and because at the end of the day, if we can navigate those things constructively, then everyone wins, right? But if we don't, then it's going to be really problematic. So I think in the Rogers case, I think the documentation was such that Ed Rogers had the authority vested in him that he ended up exercising. Now, maybe, I don't know what people thought about that. Were people aware? Maybe they were aware and they thought, well, that's theory, but that's never really going to happen. Or, as independent directors, what does that mean for us in terms of us to be able to deliver on our obligations to act in the best interests of the corporation when it seems the firing of the CEO got, I'm going to say kind of hijacked, because I think the board probably thought that, the firing of the CEO will be a full board responsibility. The hiring of the CEO will be a full board, a key core responsibility of the board. And it didn't quite play out that way. Ed Rogers had to change the board to be able to get his support for the authority that he was exercising. So how much better had they say, this is kind of an unusual corporate governance structure, given the family ownership in that. And so what are the risks of that? And how are we going to mitigate, those risks so that we can, at the end of the day, we don't end up being in the headlines every day for weeks on end, right? Like, I don't think anyone signed up for that.
No, so not at all.
Kind of the risk, right? And, I haven't been following the share price, but I think that's a bit of a moot point anyways, right? That's not the be all and the end all. It's, there's a lot of reputational risk and whatever. It may be hard to recruit board members now, for all I know.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great case study. I guess it would just have been interesting if they had focused on, kind of the power dynamics and the implications for, how things unfold in the boardroom and the relationship with the CEO. Because clearly there was lots of power plays going on a lot of one-upmanship and brinkmanship going on that I don't think anyone, you wouldn't be able to find that in a manual anywhere. So saying when conflict results, this is the game plan. This is what we're going to do.
And ultimately, no one, like as you said, no one ever expects like that something like this was ever or planned for something like this. Like it definitely wasn't in their risk register, and it was just something like that
for sure
ever happening. So
yeah, absolutely.
No really saying how to plan for something like that other than to just go with it.
For sure.
So what is the big deal about board culture when we're focused on risk and ESG compliance and the other urgent matters? Like why is that still so important?
Well, I think part of it is, or a big part of it is, getting to the best possible decisions on those topics and so many others, where the board takes full ownership and is committed to the decisions that they make, because the interactions among board members in getting to that decision are such that all the issues are on the table. There's been full, candid consideration of everything that's relevant to the decision being made. And at the end of the day, board members would be able to look back and sort of say, yep, there was nothing left on the table, nothing left unsaid. No one sort of took control. This decision represents, the will of the board as opposed to a subset. It represents, full commitment on the part of the board and not just acquiescence on the part of some, because they saw the writing on the wall. So I just think, around any of those topics, if, as I said before, board structure or process don't get you very far if, the boardroom dynamics are wonky and dysfunctional, or varying degrees of dysfunction. So I think it's around the quality of decisions that get made at the end of the day is really where the impact is.
Okay. So as a governance professional or even their boards, what can governance professionals do to ensure that corporate culture and initiatives go beyond compliance?
Right. So hopefully, I would say, perhaps facetiously, compliance is about staying out of jail. So that's kind of minimal, right? Like no one wants to end up, that's not success, staying out of jail. And so you're building on that. Obviously that's important stuff. I don't want to minimize it, but the real value a board brings, hopefully, is not mere compliance. It's, really bringing the full value of the board to positively influence the success of the organization, making a unique contribution. And so how much of that contribution is not fully realized because the boardroom culture gets in the way and doesn't allow it to be fully realized, that everyone's best thinking doesn't show up in discussions and influence the outcome. And so I think part of it is the governance professional is perhaps sensitizing their boards to the reality of this. And again, I think board members need to be convinced. They can't be pressured. They've got to own it. But I do think there's more work being done. So like one thing I did is I would feed articles, when we're doing regular mailings or something in the governance committee. I just say, hey, here's a topic that's kind of come up that I thought might be interesting and informative. And and then hopefully that sort of takes some root and the boards, identifies that as an area where, if you believe in this continuous improvement, that there's that opportunity, then I think that's a great area to affect some, really meaningful and important change that I think is going to have, you may not realize the benefits until you look back and say, this is what it used to be like, and this is what it's like now. Right. Like how much is the board not hearing from the CEO because of trust and confidence issues that may dissuade them from, being as fully open and candid about things as they might be. You'll never know until you get a sense as to, boy, the relationship with the CEO is so different. You know, like we're just,
you don't know what you had until you've lost it, pretty much.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Or you look back and you regret and say, man, we should have done something about that.
Yeah.
Because we see where we ended up.
Exactly.
And that's the problem. So yeah.
So you and Tamara are having another PD event on April the 7th about boardroom culture, an essential requirement for governing well. And in that event, you'll go over this in far more detail and post the link to that event in the show notes. Is there anything that you'd like to highlight from that event?
Yeah, well, I think just the opportunity to interact in a group and have people bring their own issues for, you know, consideration and response. So I think that's one of the real benefits. I always think, you know, governance theory is, you know, relatively easy to get your head around. It's the practical application. And you've been asking, so how can governance professionals, you know, impact this or contribute? And other ways, it's, you know, boards have certain, you know, specific challenges that we'll be able to address then. So taking kind of the principles we've talked about and really applying them where, you know, people want to get a sense as to what could we do on our board. You know, it's the challenge of understanding the human dynamics and the way to go, and maybe how to introduce some of these practices we've talked about that board members are resistant to. Yeah, and definitely we'll be delving into things a little more deeper for sure.
Great, awesome. So how else can people find out more about you or boardroom culture?
Yeah, so I have a website. So boardgovernance.ca is where people can connect with me. They can email me anytime, john@boardgovernance.ca. They can attend one of my sessions that I do with GPC or multiple. I know I see lots of return engagements on the part of participants. So yeah, be pleased to hear from people.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John, for all this information. I hope everyone who's listening finds this very insightful. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. Thank you to our listeners and for everyone's support. Don't forget to check out the show notes in the event link. If you've enjoyed this chat, please feel free to like it or to share. If someone else that you feel will benefit from this chat, you can definitely share this episode and our other episodes as well. If you want to learn more about John and corporate culture, please check out the show notes of this episode. You can also learn more about GPC by visiting our website at www.gpcanada.org. Thank you so much for joining us again today, John, and we'll see everyone again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Take care.